The matter of the second ledger first came to light, not at the police station, nor through any dramatic discovery, but over cold beef and tepid sherry at the Tuesday Rotary Club luncheon. Mr. Sutterby, Undertaker, and sometime borough councillor, had intended his anecdote to amuse, an idle reference to certain clerical inconveniences at his establishment, which might, he claimed, necessitate the retraining of his son in arithmetic. Yet something in his tone, more brittle than humorous, stirred mild curiosity among those less absorbed in their custard. It was Mrs. Teatime, of course, vicar's wife, dispenser of information both sacred and scandalous, who later translated this morsel into moral concern. He said second ledger, I'm quite sure of it, she told Miss Dibson, the librarian, who received this as though it were a fresh chapter in the Book of Revelation. And you know what that means when undertakers have two of anything, one for heaven, one for the revenue. By Wednesday morning, the matter had become a cloud of suggestion floating delicately over Flaxborough's High Street. The ironmonger knew that Sutterby's boy had been doing the books. The grocer knew that someone had been doing the Undertaker. The truth, as usual, remained obstinately stationary while gossip circled it like a flock of hungry hens. Inspector Purbright first heard of it not through complaint, but courtesy. Mrs. Teatime had called at the police station to donate a box of hymnals for the spiritual benefit of your constables. Dear. Between the Psalms and the Proverbs, she allowed a few words about Mr. Sutterby's vanished volume. Purbright, whose manner of listening resembled that of a man awaiting a bus already in sight, merely inclined his head. Vanished, you say, and not mislaid? Mrs. Teatime's eyes gleamed with the bright certainty of one unaccustomed to doubt. My dear Inspector, I have known the Sutterbys these 20 years. Nothing in that house is ever mislaid. Hidden, yes, concealed, possibly, but never mislaid. He thanked her gravely and made a note in his pocketbook, not of the alleged theft, but of the phrase hidden, yes. Purbright preferred clues that arrived unintentionally wrapped in personality. By mid-afternoon, a constable dispatched to politely confirm the report found Sutterby in his back office, composing an advertisement for sympathetic funeral arrangements, discreet terms. The man appeared, if anything, relieved to discuss his missing ledger. It was a private record, Sutterby said, his eyes fixed on the half-closed door. Purely auxiliary, you understand. A kind of memorandum for adjustments. Flowers supplied gratis, coffin linings upgraded for the deserving poor, that sort of thing. Philanthropy, Inspector, leaves little room for tidy bookkeeping, Purbright nodded mildly. One admires the impulse, Mr. Sutterby. Still, one wonders who might have wished to know of your generosity more than you wish to disclose it. Sutterby smiled. A thin inward movement like the rustle of stiff paper. That, Inspector, is precisely my concern. Outside, the afternoon lay heavy and slow over Flaxborough. The smell of fresh varnish drifted from the undertaker's workshop, and somewhere a clock in need of oil mournfully ticked behind the sound of passing bicycles. Purbright paused, glancing back at the shuttered windows of Sutterby and Son. He suspected, though he could not yet have said why, that somewhere within those polished rooms and respectful draperies, the town's sense of propriety was about to receive a most undignified disturbance. By Thursday morning, Flaxborough had achieved that delicate equilibrium between knowing almost everything and understanding nothing at all. Mr. Sutterby's vanished ledger had become a moral Rorschach test, revealing more about the gossipers than the subject itself. At the post office, Mrs. Glossop spoke of it with the pained satisfaction of one long vindicated. I said to my husband only last week, those undertakers know more about people than is good for them. Births, deaths, debts, it all goes through their hands. At the grocer's, a contrary view prevailed. Mr. Emmett, weighing out sugar, declared the whole affair a clerical accident. A man in that trade's bound to keep 2 books, he reasoned. One for accounts, one for... appearances?" The pause implied an admiration for duplicity, provided it was done tastefully. Miss Dibson, the librarian, approached the matter as a literary puzzle. She had already drafted a note to the Flaxborough Chronicle suggesting a comparison with Dickens's Our Mutual Friend. "There's a thematic resemblance," she told her assistant solemnly, "between funerals and finance." Evening brought the mayor's response, a brief, irritated comment to his wife that no respectable firm would allow private documents to go wandering about. He said this loudly enough for their maid to overhear, thus ensuring it would be repeated by breakfast. Purbright, meanwhile, received a brief memorandum from his superintendent. Treat matter as civil until evidence dictates otherwise. It was the sort of instruction that translated easily into doing nothing with quiet efficiency, a skill at which Purbright excelled. Nevertheless, his curiosity lingered. There was something too tidy about Sutterby's story, too measured, as though rehearsed for the benefit of anyone who might ask. A man genuinely embarrassed rarely speaks with such calm precision. On Friday, Purbright took a slow walk along the high street under the pretext of checking licensing notices. He paused at the Undertaker's window, noting that the drapes had been changed overnight from deep plum to a lighter grey, a gesture, perhaps, toward transparency. Inside he could see young Mr. Sutterby polishing a nameplate that already gleamed. Across the street, Mrs. Teatime emerged from the confectioner's with a small bag of barley sugar and a large sense of moral triumph. She greeted Purbright with a knowing smile. "I suppose you've recovered the object by now?" "Not yet," he replied gently. "Though it may, in time, recover itself." She laughed, a bright, brittle sound that turned several heads. "Oh, Inspector, you do make everything sound so respectable." "Respectability, Mrs. Teatime," Purbright said, "is one of our more economical disguises. By Saturday, the gossip had cooled into that polite silence Flaxborough adopted whenever scandal seemed both undeniable and inconvenient. Church bulletins mentioned generosity, not ledgers. The Chronicle printed an unrelated item about stray cats. But beneath the surface calm, the town's social nerves twitched. The Undertaker's ledger had vanished, yes, but what else, people wondered, might soon come to light. As dusk fell over the market square, Purbright stood outside his office window, watching the lamplighter move down the street. The town, outwardly composed, seemed to hold its breath, a genteel stillness before the next, inevitable stir. He suspected that whatever had been written in that missing ledger, its absence was already writing a different sort of account in Flaxborough's conscience. By Monday morning, the Undertaker's office had resumed its outward decorum, though an undercurrent of tension seemed to hum faintly beneath the scent of polish and lilies. Purbright arrived without ceremony, his notebook discreetly tucked beneath his arm, his manner suggesting a man come to discuss drainage rather than deceit. Mr. Sutterby received him with a careful civility. The Undertaker's black frock coat appeared newly brushed, and his expression hovered between humility and self-importance. "Inspector," he began, "I do hope this business hasn't given the wrong impression. The loss was trifling, really, a private inconvenience." Purbright regarded him mildly. "I've noticed that private inconveniences, when aired in public, tend to become moral spectacles. It's one of the town's more reliable transformations." Sutterby's lips twitched. "I had thought to avoid that. Unfortunately, my son has been, overzealous in discussing our accounts." The son in question appeared at the doorway then, pale and earnest, clutching a sheaf of papers as though they might explode. Purbright greeted him with a small nod. "Perhaps, Mr. Sutterby, your son could remind us where the ledger was last seen?" "Certainly," the young man stammered. "It was in father's office, the right-hand drawer. I may have taken it out briefly on Thursday." "To check figures. Figures relating to?" "Discounted services," he said quickly, "would be for parish cases. We keep 2 records, the official and the charitable." Purbright made no note, though his brow furrowed slightly. A generous enterprise.
I imagine it complicates taxation.
The elder Sutterby's cough served as answer enough. Purbright thanked them both and departed as gently as he had arrived, leaving behind the faint discomfort of someone who had tidied the room, yet felt it somehow untidier than before. At the police station, he found Constable Love polishing his boots with academic concentration. "Sir," Love said, straightening guiltily. A black notebook was handed in from behind the Methodist Hall. "Thought it might interest you." Purbright accepted the item. It was small, scuffed, and smelled faintly of violets. Inside, in an elegant, looping hand, were notes, mostly mundane, until one entry caught his eye. "Ledger misplaced. Better not mention it again." "HP, HP," Purbright murmured. "Our Harold Pym, perhaps? The assistant?" Love frowned. "He's the one who collects bodies, sir." "Doesn't seem the bookkeeping type." Purbright closed the notebook softly. "Then perhaps he's learned to diversify." That afternoon, he paid a call at the Methodist Hall under pretext of inquiring about lost property. The caretaker, a woman of severe hairstyle and suspicious virtue, confirmed that Mr. Pym often came by after hours. "To store things, he says."
Never tells me what.
Returning to his office, Purbright set the notebook on his desk and regarded it in silence. Nothing in the town was ever as it appeared. Generosity masked profit. Discretion concealed fear. The ledger's disappearance, he felt, was less an act of theft than of self-preservation. Someone had wished to erase a line too carefully drawn. As dusk gathered over Flaxborough, Purbright leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile touching his lips. The town might settle for its familiar comforts of gossip and rumour, but he sensed the true story. Quiet,
Unhurried, was only just beginning to speak. By Tuesday morning,
the town's patience with uncertainty had worn as thin as the mayor's smile at a ratepayers' meeting. Something had to be concluded, preferably about someone else. Miss Avril Peebles, lately dismissed clerk of Sutterby and Son, presented herself as the ideal candidate, young enough to be foolish, proud enough to be resented, and, most importantly, no longer employed to defend herself within hearing distance. It was the mayor who first voiced what others had politely implied. Over a plate of haddock at the Market Cafe, he confided to Councillor Buttery, "I always thought Miss Peebles a touch too clever for her station. Those girls who type with both hands tend to have ambitions." Buttery, who had once received a sharply worded invoice from her, nodded solemnly. Within hours, the conclusion had travelled comfortably through the town. The ledger had been taken by a woman with ideas above her stationery. Purbright heard this theory from no less a source than Mrs. Teatime, who relayed it with the air of someone performing civic duty. "And she was seen," she added gravely, "near the Undertaker's on the very evening it disappeared. Carrying, I am told, a brown parcel of suspicious proportion." Purbright smiled faintly. "Suspicious proportion is, I think, a relative term in Flaxborough. Did anyone see her open it?" Mrs. Teatime blinked. "Good heavens, Inspector, one doesn't stare at such things." That afternoon, Purbright requested Miss Peebles attend the station. She arrived precisely on time, composed but with the defensive stillness of one who expects insult disguised as courtesy. Her gloves were immaculate, her expression politely fatigued. "I understand," Purbright began, "that you handled certain correspondence and accounts during your employment with Mr. Sutterby." "For 3 years," she replied, "until I was replaced by his son, who, I might mention, can neither spell cemetery nor total a column twice the same way." "You left of your own accord?"
I was asked to seek alternative opportunities, she said, her tone brittle.
"Apparently my efficiency created a clerical imbalance." Purbright allowed a moment of silence. "And the missing ledger?" She met his gaze evenly.
"I know nothing about it, though I do know Mr. Sutterby kept 2, one honest, one imaginative."
The second, he said, made the first look respectable. "Would you say he feared discovery?" "I'd say," she replied, slipping on her gloves, that he feared embarrassment far more. After she left, Purbright sat quietly, reviewing his notes. Every word she had spoken carried the ring of wounded truth, though perhaps too clearly struck. He could not yet decide whether she sought exoneration or admiration. Still, something about her calm precision, the absence of surprise, suggested she already knew what others merely suspected. That evening, Constable Love appeared, holding a small paper bag. "From the chemist's, sir. Mr. Bannister found it behind his counter. Empty envelope addressed to him. No stamp, no sender. Same handwriting as on the Undertaker's invoices." Purbright studied the neat, looping script.
"And there is no Mr. H. Bannister in Flaxborough?" "No, sir."
"But there was one. Died 5 years ago." Purbright nodded slowly. "Then it seems our correspondence has crossed the boundary between bookkeeping and resurrection." He closed the envelope with care, his expression unreadable. The town had found its culprit, neatly labelled and morally convenient. Yet Purbright, gazing at the fading ink of a dead man's name, suspected that Flaxborough's little scandal had only just begun to stir beneath its own respectability. By Thursday morning, the town's appetite for scandal had grown restless again, and Flaxborough's post office, an establishment normally more concerned with pension forms than intrigue, unexpectedly found itself in the thick of mystery. Mrs. Glossop, its vigilant mistress, had intercepted what she called a most improper confusion of correspondence. The envelope, addressed to Mr. H. Bannister, chemist, bore neither stamp nor sense, and the return address, Sutterby and Son, funeral directors, was neatly inscribed in the Undertaker's unmistakable hand. When Purbright arrived to inspect the object, Mrs. Glossop met him with the solemnity of one presenting a state secret. "I said to myself, Inspector, this isn't ordinary misposting. The handwriting's precise, yet the message feels evasive." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And the strangest thing, it was slipped into the night box, not posted at all." Purbright examined the envelope under the counter's yellow light. The paper was of good quality, faintly scented with linseed. A small smudge marked the corner, perhaps from an inky thumb or from hesitation. He held it between finger and thumb. "You've not opened it, Mrs. Glossop?" She looked shocked. "Certainly not." "I respect privacy, even suspicious privacy." "Quite right," Purbright murmured, pocketing it gently. "It's a fragile thing, after all." Back at the station, he slit the flap carefully. Inside lay a single folded sheet, blank save for one penciled word, reconcile. No name, no date, no context, merely that quiet imperative. Purbright studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he rang for Constable Love. "Love, when was Mr. Bannister's pharmacy finally sold?" "About 4 years ago, sir. The new owner's that fellow from Grantham, changed the name, of course." "And the late Mr. Bannister himself, how did he die?" Love blinked. "Heart attack, wasn't it?" "During a council dinner," Purbright nodded. "A setting notorious for both indigestion and irony." He slipped the note back into its envelope. The message, he thought, was unlikely to be directed toward the deceased pharmacist. Yet its wording, neither threat nor plea, suggested an unease of conscience. Someone in Flaxborough wished to settle a matter, but not in daylight. Late that afternoon, Purbright walked once more to Sutterby and Son. The Undertaker was out, attending what his assistant described as a client of unusual persistence. The assistant himself, Harold Pym, was pale, distracted, and distinctly wary of eye contact. "Busy day?" Purbright asked mildly. "Moderate, sir. People die whether one's ledger's gone or not." "True," Purbright said, "though the record of it seems to trouble your employer rather more." He produced the envelope. "You'll recognize this handwriting." Pym's eyes flicked to it, then away too quickly. "That would be Mr. Sutterby's, sir. But the address I couldn't say." "No. Perhaps you could say instead why your initials, H.P., appear in a notebook found near the Methodist Hall." Pym swallowed. "Just personal notes, sir. Nothing." "Nothing official?" Purbright smiled faintly, his gaze patient but unrelenting. Of course, most personal things become official once mislaid. As he left, Purbright paused by the window where an empty coffin, lined in pale satin, lay on display, a symbol of order, finality, and peace. Yet something in the symmetry of the scene felt slightly rehearsed, as though even death in Flaxborough wished to maintain good appearances. That evening, he wrote a single line in his own notebook before locking it away. The living, not the dead, require reconciliation. Sunday morning arrived with its usual pageantry of virtue. The bells of St. Botolph's rang earnestly, as though volume might compensate for attendance. Reverend Hooper, whose sermons were famous for their length and vagueness, had chosen honesty in all dealings as his text, an irony not lost on those who knew of Mr. Sutterby's recent benevolence toward church repairs. The Undertaker's name appeared discreetly on the donation list pinned near the vestry door. Anonymous gift, 75s. In Flaxborough, anonymity was considered the most elegant form of confession. Purbright, attending partly out of duty and partly for the pleasure of quiet observation, watched from a back pew. His gaze drifted from the pulpit to the congregation. The town's worthies gathered in uneasy harmony. Mrs. Teatime sat stiffly near the aisle, glancing from face to face with a suspicion that passed for devout concentration. Beside her, young Mr. Sutterby shifted uneasily, his lips moving faintly, perhaps in prayer or arithmetic. The Reverend, warming to his theme, declared that truth may be concealed but not erased, a line that prompted a faint murmur of discomfort among the choir. After the service, in the gentle crush of the churchyard, polite conversation resumed its usual work of interpretation. Mrs. Teatime confided to Miss Dibson that the sermon had been entirely about the Undertaker, though she couldn't say how. Mr. Emmett, the grocer, thought it a fine warning to those who play with numbers. Meanwhile, Purbright, lingering near the lich gate, found himself approached by Harold Pym. The young man looked pale beneath his hat, his voice uncertain.
Inspector, I've been meaning to, clarify something about that notebook. Purbright regarded him mildly.
Clarification is always welcome, provided it doesn't make matters murkier. Pym swallowed.
It wasn't stolen. I left it there by accident.
I'd written things.
I shouldn't have, about Mr. Sutterby.
Pym hesitated.
About the arrangements.
Some of the funerals weren't charged properly. The figures didn't match the receipts.
I thought he'd correct them later. And when he didn't? I kept quiet, Pym said, almost whispering.
But Miss Peebles found out. She said it could ruin us both. And the ledger vanished. Purbright studied him carefully. You're suggesting she took it? I don't know. But I think she knew what was in it. Before Purbright could reply, the Reverend Hooper emerged from the vestry, beaming with self-approval.
Inspector.
I trust the sermon struck the right balance between morality and mercy. Perfectly balanced, Purbright said. One could almost imagine the subject had been chosen with practical application. The Reverend's smile faltered. We must all reconcile our accounts, spiritual and otherwise. Yes, Purbright murmured. Some are more particular about ledgers than others. As the crowd dispersed, the churchyard fell quiet, save for the cooing of doves on the roof. Purbright lingered a moment longer, gazing at the row of weathered stones. Flaxborough's dead, he thought, lay with greater integrity than its living. The generous donation, the sermon on honesty, the Undertaker's sudden piety, each gesture seemed less about faith than atonement. Walking back through the narrow lanes, he reflected that deception often dressed itself in its Sunday best. In Flaxborough, as in Scripture, confession rarely came from the guilty. It came from those afraid of being mistaken for them. By Wednesday, the matter of the missing ledger had begun to fade beneath the surface of Flaxborough's collective conscience, until death,
as it so often did, restored interest. Mrs. Morpeth,
a long-time customer of Sutterby and Son and a fixture of every parish fete, passed away in her sleep at the respectable age of 73. Her departure was described by the vicar as peaceful, though the timing, so soon after the Undertaker's tribulations, seemed almost impertinent. It was mid-morning when Purbright received the call. Constable Love, sounding unusually thoughtful, announced that Mr. Sutterby had reported a minor irregularity concerning Mrs. Morpeth's funeral account. He says the family ledger doesn't match his, Love said.
And he'd like the matter.
Discreetly examined, Purbright's tone was mild.
Ah, another ledger. How consistent of him. He found Sutterby waiting in his office, outwardly calm, but with a twitch of unease at the corner of his mouth. It's nothing, Inspector, nothing sinister.
Simply a clerical inconsistency. Mrs. Morpeth's arrangements were made years ago, prepaid, as many of our better families prefer. But when I checked the old files, her receipt, well, it didn't correspond with the amount recorded. How large a difference? £17 and 10 shillings, Purbright raised an eyebrow. Enough to trouble the charitable, Sutterby spread his hands. The woman was particular. She wanted certain embellishments. Lace linings and oak finish. Her funds would have covered it, but someone, I fear, altered the entry. Recently? I cannot say. The handwriting isn't mine, nor my son's. Purbright considered this in silence. The handwriting, he suspected, would soon appear familiar.
And who stands to gain from the confusion?
No one now, Sutterby said tightly. She's gone. The funeral was scheduled for Friday. By Thursday, word of the accounting error had leaked, thanks predictably to Mrs. Teatime, who relayed the tale with reverent horror.
£17 short,
she told Miss Dibson.
Imagine robbing a coffin of its dignity.
Meanwhile, Purbright paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Morpeth's cottage, now watched over by her niece, a prim woman from Lincoln with a suspicion of everyone local. She showed him the deceased's correspondence, neatly tied bundles of receipts, all marked in the same steady hand except one bearing faint traces of erasure. It was dated the week Miss Peebles had left the Undertaker's. Back at the station, Purbright studied the note once more, the word reconcile seeming to darken with meaning. Mrs. Morpeth's prepaid funeral might have been the last account the vanished ledger recorded. If so, someone had tried to correct it, or conceal it, too late. That evening, as rain began to patter against the station windows, Constable Love entered with cautious hesitation.
Sir, about Mrs. Morpeth's body, Dr. Hinksworth says there's nothing unusual.
But he did mention the coffin was ordered before she died. Purbright looked up. Before? 2 days, sir. Mr. Sutterby placed the order himself. Said she'd been ailing. Purbright closed his notebook slowly. In Flaxborough, premonition was rarely prophetic. It was administrative. Someone had known the old lady's time would come and made sure the accounts were tidy first. As he stood, gazing out into the rain-darkened street, the Undertaker's windows glowed faintly across the square. Respectable, decorous, and closed to inquiry. Death had returned to its usual business. Yet the timing, like the books, was just a little too neat. Friday dawned over Flaxborough with a pale drizzle, and the faint sound of someone practicing hymns on an out-of-tune piano. The town was in subdued motion, its people not quite mourning Mrs. Morpeth so much as enjoying the renewed moral excitement her passing had inspired. Purbright, immune to both weather and sentiment, sat in the police canteen with a cup of tea that had long since surrendered warmth and flavour. He stirred it absently, watching the faint swirl of milk settle into an indifferent grey. Constable Love entered, looking uncertain whether to salute or apologise.
So the coffin's been sealed.
The family want the burial tomorrow morning, Purbright nodded. Understandable. The living rarely wish to linger near the dead once propriety's been satisfied. Love hesitated. Dr. Hinksworth says there's no need for further examination. There never is until there is, Purbright murmured. Did he remark on the time of death? Between 11 and 1 in the morning, he thinks.
Natural causes.
She was frail. Purbright nodded again, then set down his spoon with quiet precision.
And the Undertaker, was he notified promptly? Immediately.
He sent young Pym with the van before dawn. Efficient, that one. Efficiency, Purbright said, is admirable in moderation. Beyond that, it becomes foreknowledge. Love frowned, unsure whether that was an observation or an instruction. Purbright spared him further discomfort.
Tell me, have you ever noticed how people speak of the dead as though they've joined a better parish? Can't say I have, sir. They do, Purbright continued almost to himself.
It comforts them to believe the deceased are now managed by a more competent authority. Love nodded politely, recognizing the tone that meant he was no longer required to understand. He retreated, leaving Purbright alone with his tea. The inspector's mind wandered through the details. A missing ledger, an undertaker's gift to the church, a letter to a dead chemist, a death ordered 2 days early. None of it quite fitted, and yet none of it seemed accidental. In Flaxborough, error was never random, it was strategic. He rose, refilled his cup, and wandered to the window. Outside, the rain had turned the cobbles slick and dark. Across the street, the Undertaker's shutters were half closed, as though the business preferred to peer at the world through caution. A black wreath hung discreetly on the door for Mrs. Morpeth, its ribbons fluttering in the damp breeze. Purbright's reflection stared back at him in the glass, calm, middle-aged, unreadable. He wondered briefly how much of the town saw him as part of the furniture, another fixture of order. Perhaps that was for the best. A detective too visible disturbed the social balance. Better to blend into the wallpaper and listen for the creak behind it. The kettle hissed somewhere in the back room, and a clock struck 4:30. Purbright returned to his desk, flipped open his notebook, and wrote a single line beneath his previous note. When charity grows profitable, virtue becomes arithmetic. He drew a line beneath it, as if sealing the thought away for later use. Evening came quietly. The rain ceased, leaving the air heavy and metallic. Purbright watched the street lamps flicker to life and considered the pattern emerging, not of murder, perhaps, but of manipulation. Someone in Flaxborough was tidying accounts with a reverence that went beyond bookkeeping. He finished his tea, cold now but steadying, and murmured softly to himself. People rarely kill for greed here. They do it for neatness. By Monday afternoon, the town had settled into its customary post-funeral calm. The wreaths were fading, the gossip softening into reminiscence, and Sutterby and Son had resumed their polite trade with an air of spotless respectability. To most eyes, the matter of Mrs. Morpeth's passing was closed. To Purbright's, it had simply become quiet, enough to listen to properly. He decided it was time to test what he called the elasticity of conscience. A visit to the Undertaker's office seemed the natural setting, civilized surroundings, a veneer of mourning, and enough ledgers to make truth feel at home. Sutterby greeted him with professional solemnity. "Inspector," he said, "I hope this isn't another of those misunderstandings. The town's been rather over-attentive lately." "Quite so," Purbright agreed, removing his hat. "I merely wish to discuss an administrative curiosity. One of your ledgers, perhaps you can clarify which remains unaccounted for." Sutterby hesitated, the faintest crack appearing in his polished composure.
That? A secondary record of goodwill disbursements, as I mentioned before. Misplaced, I assume, by my assistant. Mr. Pym, Purbright said mildly. A diligent young man.
And yet, curiously anxious, his nerves, Inspector.
Not everyone in this business possesses the right detachment. Detachment, Purbright echoed.
Yes, that quality must be indispensable when dealing with clients who never complain. Sutterby forced a laugh, short and brittle. Precisely so. Purbright laid his notebook gently on the desk as if placing a small wager. "You may be pleased to know, sir, that I've arranged for a brief audit of certain parish accounts, charitable burials, discounts, subsidies from the Poor Relief Committee. Routine, of course.
I've even mentioned the second ledger.
The auditors are curious, he spoke lightly, almost idly, but the effect was immediate. A faint tremor passed through the Undertaker's hand as he reached for his pen. The ink blotted slightly on the paper before him. "Oh, there's no need for alarm," Purbright continued softly. "These things are often dull. Still, any explanation you can provide about the missing sums might prove helpful before they arrive." Sutterby's face settled into a fixed politeness.
I assure you there are no missing sums. Excellent, Purbright said cheerfully.
"Then perhaps your assistant can confirm that when I see him tomorrow." At this, the Undertaker's pen froze mid-line. He looked up sharply. "You've spoken to Harold?" "Not yet. I prefer to let conscience compose itself before conversation begins." Purbright smiled, replaced his hat, and took his leave. He had not raised his voice, not implied accusation, and yet when he stepped into the cool evening air, he felt the delicate vibration of unease ripple through the tidy building behind him. That night, at the station, he found a note slipped beneath his office door. It was unsigned, the handwriting quick and uncertain. "He's burning papers tonight. Come after 9. Purbright folded it carefully, placed it in his pocket, and switched off the light. He had expected the reaction. He had merely been curious to see how soon it would come. By 9:15, the lane behind Sutterby and Son was dark, except for the dim orange flicker leaking from a half-open window. Purbright watched from the shadow of a lamp-post as two figures moved within, the elder Sutterby, calm but hurried, and young Pym, pale, glancing toward the door. The faint smell of singed paper drifted into the cool air. Purbright turned away without interfering. His experiment had succeeded. Guilt, once warmed by the suggestion of discovery, burned quite willingly on its own. It was the following afternoon when Inspector Purbright, appearing as mild and unhurried as ever, requested the company of several concerned citizens at the mayor's residence. The invitation was worded with bureaucratic politeness, a brief clarification regarding the recent accounts affair, and was accepted with varying degrees of curiosity, trepidation and indignation. By 4 o'clock, the drawing-room was thick with the scent of tea, anxiety, and hyacinths. Mr. Sutterby sat nearest the window, his complexion the colour of unpolished pewter. Harold Pym occupied the far end of the settee, his eyes lowered, as if afraid to catch anyone else's thoughts. The Reverend Hooper hovered by the mantelpiece, rehearsing expressions of moral approval, while Mrs. Teatime and the mayor completed the audience, each determined to appear indispensable to civic order. Purbright entered last, carrying his familiar notebook. He declined tea, glanced amiably around the company, and began in a tone more suited to weather reports than revelation. "It appears," he said, "that the confusion surrounding Sutterby and Son's ledgers was not, as first imagined, the work of mischief or outside theft. Rather, it was an attempt, ill-advised but almost touching in its purpose, to protect a reputation already somewhat overextended." Sutterby stirred, then froze as Purbright's calm gaze settled upon him. "You see," the inspector continued, "for years, the firm's accounts contained what one might call charitable adjustments, reductions granted to the poor, upgrades for the respectable, all financed by creative bookkeeping. Unfortunately, generosity becomes precarious when it begins to expect interest. A secondary ledger was maintained to balance the differences, part benevolence, part deception." He turned a page. Miss Peebles, when she discovered the arrangement, refused to be complicit. Her dismissal followed shortly after. Mr. Pym, loyal and frightened, continued the practice, though with increasing difficulty. When the figures became unsustainable, someone decided to erase the evidence. Thus, the second ledger vanished. Sutterby spoke hoarsely. "You can't prove any of that." Purbright's voice remained gentle.
"I don't need to."
"Your own fire did. Paper burns most willingly when it has something to hide. Fortunately, Mr. Pym, in his confusion, preserved a few pages before the rest were destroyed." All eyes turned to Pym. The young man's lips parted, then closed again. He seemed to shrink where he sat.
"I didn't mean harm," he murmured.
He said it was only to put things right. Indeed, Purbright said softly. And so it was. Mrs. Morpeth's death simply arrived too soon to accommodate the correction. Her prepaid account, reduced in your books, Mr. Sutterby, would have revealed the missing sums if not for the convenient timing of her passing. The Reverend coughed, scandalized. "Surely you're not implying—" "I'm implying nothing," Purbright interrupted mildly. "Mrs. Morpeth died naturally, but her coffin was ordered in advance, and the payment discrepancy was settled the day before. That, I think, speaks more eloquently than I could." The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "And no crime as such?" "Fraud, technically," Purbright said. "Though one seasoned by piety and self-justification, it will be handled quietly. Mr. Sutterby has agreed to retire, and Mr. Pym will find employment elsewhere, somewhere less concerned with reconciliation." He closed his notebook, signalling the end of both the explanation and the pretense of civility. "As for the rest," he added, "I recommend a little less moral arithmetic in future. Flaxborough's virtue, like its tea, is best served weak but honest." There was a silence, long enough for the clock to chime 5. Then Mrs. Teatimes sighed, with the contentment of one who had witnessed justice without discomfort.
"I always said," she murmured, "the truth would out." Purbright smiled faintly.
"It generally does, Mrs. Teatime. One only has to give it time and perhaps a nudge." In the days that followed, Flaxborough resumed its familiar rhythm as though the Undertaker's disgrace had been little more than a hiccup in the town's digestion. The High Street, tidy and self-absorbed once more, carried on exchanging niceties with the same precision as change over a counter. Mr. Sutterby's departure, announced in a modest notice in the Chronicle, was phrased delicately. Mr. Sutterby thanks his many patrons for their custom and trust, and withdraws on grounds of health. There were few inquiries about which particular health had failed him, moral or physical. The business passed nominally to his son, though it was understood that the young man's energies leaned more toward leisure than ledgers. Harold Pym, discreetly encouraged to seek employment elsewhere, was last seen boarding the afternoon train to Peterborough, clutching a suitcase and an expression of startled relief. The Reverend Hooper, in his next sermon, avoided the topic of honesty entirely and instead addressed the virtue of moving forward in faith, a phrase which many found both comforting and conveniently adaptable. Mrs. Teatime naturally became the town's unofficial chronicler of events. Her version of the affair grew in moral significance each time she told it, until she could recall having suspected Mr. Sutterby's peculiar kindness years earlier. "I always say," she informed anyone available to listen, "that charity begins at home and sometimes ends at the police station." Purbright, meanwhile, returned to his paperwork, a task he performed with quiet satisfaction. He preferred the order of reports, the ink, the evidence, the firm lines that separated fact from speculation. Yet even as he filed away the final statement, he knew that Flaxborough's peace was less restored than rearranged. The town's conscience, freshly polished, would soon acquire new fingerprints. That evening, as dusk softened the rooftops, he strolled through the market square. The shops were closing, lamps flickering to life, and the air carried that peculiar contentment which settles after scandal has safely passed. From the churchyard came the faint toll of the bell for evensong, slow, resigned, as if it too had learned the futility of moral precision. Purbright paused outside the Undertaker's, now shuttered and silent. The gilt lettering on the sign had begun to tarnish in the damp, catching the lamplight in dull glints. He considered the irony. A man who had buried others with such impeccable ceremony had nearly buried himself beneath the weight of his own bookkeeping. Flaxborough's crimes, he reflected, were never grand. They were merely the by-products of civility taken too seriously. Back at the station, he poured himself a final cup of tea and leaned back in his chair. Love was polishing the brass buttons on his tunic humming faintly. The world outside was quiet, and for once there were no letters marked urgent. "You think that's the end of it, sir?" Love asked after a pause. Purbright smiled faintly. "There's never an end, love, only an intermission. Human nature dislikes an empty stage." He sipped his tea, allowing the silence to reclaim the room. The gaslight hummed softly, the paper pile stood obediently in order, and somewhere beyond the window, Flaxborough breathed its small, self-satisfied sigh of relief, for now at least. The town's sense of virtue was comfortably restored, polished, dusted and ready for the next disturbance. Purbright closed his notebook, extinguished the light, and stepped into the corridor, leaving behind only the faint aroma of tea and the quiet satisfaction of a mystery resolved without drama. The station door clicked shut behind him, and the night, cool and perfectly ordinary, folded itself back over the town